Hi, good afternoon. My name is Sarah O'Leary Driscoll, and today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about comprehending multiple texts and how we can help our students with this endeavor. So why do we not just use textbooks in the classroom? Well, there's a number of different reasons. One of the main ones for me is that even though they have a lot of information, they may not always have the depth that we want our students to know. They can also be a little bit less engaging for students to read because they don't have a narrative or story-like form. And so the writing can be a little bit dry. They can also go out of date pretty quickly. I teach science, and I know in biology in particular, when I pick up a 15-year-old textbook, there's some things in it that we know a lot more about today. And so some of the information is either incomplete or sometimes inaccurate. The other part of this is that having only one textbook is a little bit authoritarian. So we want to strive to help our students see content from a number of different perspectives. But if we're only using one textbook, that goes against that a little bit and tends to give them the impression that there's really one source of information out there for the content that you're trying to cover. Textbooks are not all bad, though. They're really great as resources or reference guides for students. So a lot of times they're useful for starting points to get them started with things like vocabulary. Sometimes they have really good figures. And so if we use them as reference guides, they do have their place. But on their own, they aren't quite enough for good comprehension. So multiple texts can help students to gain multiple perspectives and also to ask more questions. So whether it's comparing, contrasting, connecting different texts, or asking how they fit together, these are all really important. So the list below is an example of some questions that students might come up with when they're looking at aspects of history from different perspectives. So they might look at, what do the primary sources say? How does that compare to what other authors are saying? Did they omit any events or change how they said things happen? Were there alternate solutions that were talked about in different texts? And how did some of these past decisions, discoveries, connections affect our lives today? So having these extra questions and looking at these from various viewpoints can really lead to powerful conversations as students start to talk about the material. So in terms of how we position the use of multiple texts in the classroom, we have to consider what our major goals are. So in this figure, I thought was pretty helpful because it shows that the major area is the context or the content that we want them to learn. And the task is really the skills or what we want them to do or be able to do when they're done. So for example, understanding the complexities of a specific topic. And knowing kind of the context and the task, then that can help us select specific texts that can assist the students when they use them together to accomplish those tasks and understand the content in a deeper way. It's really interesting to look at the use of multiple texts over time in education. So this graphic is showing the number of Google Scholar citations. So research papers in education that reference the use of multiple texts in student literacy. So you can see back in the 1980s, there was really none. And I looked at around 2001, which is when I graduated high school. We primarily used textbooks, and that's sort of reflected here. There wasn't a whole lot of discussion of how to use multiple texts together. But as you get closer and closer to today, there's a really dramatic increase in how much research is focusing on using multiple texts for student literacy. And that's a really good sign that that's starting to become more widespread in the educational community. So there are three major components of using multiple texts in the classroom. The first is comprehension. So this is basically, how do the students understand each text individually, whether this is a spoken, written, or visual text that we're using. So it's the active process of extracting and constructing meaning. So it's important that they do this on each individual text that we're using before they start to get to the next levels. So the next level is analysis. So this focuses more on learning the nature of the parts and the relationships and how things fit together. This is where the examination gets a little bit more careful and close, and we see more reflection on what's being written. And then the major goal here is synthesis, is how do students use these multiple texts together in order to form a new, a broadened, or a deepened understanding. So these help, all of these three things together are really important when you use the multiple texts in the classroom. So in order to how some different ways to help students to use these multiple texts effectively. For comprehension, good note-taking is a really good idea. It'll help students to identify major ideas and basically get new vocabulary down. In terms of analysis, graphic organizers are very helpful because it can help kind of connect and organize the major ideas both within one text or between multiple texts. And then synthesis, this is a good way to do this is through writing. So writing for understanding. So writing will help basically solidify the connections and get the students to a more holistic understanding of the material. Writing is also important just as a skill of communication. So it's important that students understand, but also that they can communicate their understanding. So the more practice they get with writing, the better they'll be in the long run. So when we talk about good note-taking, one really good way to start is with annotating and coding. So coding is a way to basically reflect what's happening in the reader's mind as they go. And this also helps for the reader to reflect back after their reading to see where they found things to be important, where they found confusion, where they made some connections between what they know and what is being mentioned in the text. And so the list on the left shows some examples of text codes that students can start with. So a good idea might be to print this out and then cut it apart so students have a reference as they're reading. So they can think, oh, this is something that contradicts what I thought before. And they look over here and they say, oh, I can put an X there. So I remember that that's what I was thinking at that time. I find that as students get better at working with note-taking, for example, doing a lot of writing in the margins and taking notes off of things, the amount of text codes that they use tends to shrink a little bit. This is also true for what I find for myself, that I often have stars and lines and things like that. And instead of having things like R reminds you of something, I might just make a note on the side that says, oh, this sounds like, and then give the actual reference for what I had learned before. So coding and annotation can look very different depending on what works best for an individual. So highlighting in different colors sometimes is really helpful. So to talk about, like, is this vocabulary? Is this something I have a question about? Is this something I understand pretty well? This picture made me laugh because it says, oh, snap on the side. So maybe that was something that was unexpected that a student read about. Students can also do things like underline or circle vocabulary, or if they can't actually write on the text that they're using, sticky notes can be really helpful. So instead of having things directly on the text, they can put the sticky notes with their ideas on them. So the whole goal with this is that it reflects the thought process of the reader as they're going through the text. And that makes it easier as the reader reflects on the text or goes into discussions or starts to do some of these next steps, that they can reference some of the major points and where they had questions very easily without having to read everything again. So I like this as an example. I actually use this in a previous assignment in this course, but also is something that I would show my students of, this is how I might code and annotate a science article in a realistic way. So it looks kind of messy. And that's okay. So a lot of times students are reluctant to actually like get in there and write on the text that they're using. But when I look back through this, I can say, oh, look, I put a star there. That's really important. I had a question because I didn't know what, for example, at the top, rhythmic signaling was. So I know I need to find that out. And then, I put extra exclamation points on something that I thought was extra important. And so I can look back very easily and understand kind of what my thought process was and where I need to look into things a little bit further. So graphic organizers are good for the analysis portion of using multiple texts. I like this one because it's a concept map of a concept map, but you can see that it has multiple ways for things to be connected. So you can see that, for example, integrating concepts into current knowledge comes over here from construction of a concept map, and also can be meaningful for learning. So it's important to kind of see that there can be overlap here. It also has good flow. So you can see from a concept map, the most important thing is this, and this is what it's for, and this is what it leads to. So these can be used in different ways to visualize text, whether it's a narrative of what's happening or information that students need to know. This is an example of a graphic organizer using MindModo, and this is a graphic organizer of this presentation. And so you can see this is a little bit more hierarchical. So it has kind of the main idea at the top, and then it has kind of the three branches of what we're talking about, and then the details come underneath. And so this is a good way if students are more inclined to do things like outlining. MindModo actually will turn this sort of map into an outline for you, which can be useful, but also it's good as a visual to see how things are connected for students. I love showing things like this also because I use concept maps quite a lot in my biology classes, and this is an example of one that looks incredibly chaotic, but is actually something I was really happy about that the students did. So what I told them was basically to take this whole list, you can see some of them over on the left, and make connections between all of them, and then at some point somewhere explain their connections. And so what they've done here is numbered the connections they've made and explained them on the side. I actually was really happy with this group when they started making these lines cross and everything, because I heard them discussing, well, wait a minute, communication also, connects to mating. This is a behavior class, but it's also part of reciprocal altruism. And so the discussion that they were having was really the important part. So even though the organizer itself may be a little bit hard to read after the fact, it can also be just an active process for students, and the process is more important than actually what they come up with. I also really like to use whiteboards for concept maps and different graphic organizers because it's easy to erase. The online ones are also good for this. So that means that as the students are organizing their thoughts, they can change their mind, which is what happens when they learn more. So as they go through their thought processes and think about these connections, and maybe they get some questions answered that they had, they may want to go back and change where some of these lines are drawn. So having them on a whiteboard or somewhere that they're easy to manipulate versus somewhere where they would normally be static, I find is helpful. The stress of having something written in marker on a poster board sometimes is a lot for students because they're like, what if this is wrong? Or what if I change my mind? I can't change it. And so having that flexibility, I think, really adds to the usefulness of the graphic organizers. So the last part with synthesis is writing to learn. So why is writing so important for learning? First of all, it increases reading fluency, which is really awesome. So the more that someone writes, they actually get better at reading as well. It also really causes students to stop and think about the topics. So instead of just kind of walking out of class being like, oh yeah, that made sense, I understand the concepts that we talked about, they have to really stop and put them in their own words to put them down on paper. So it gives them kind of a pause to make sure that they really did capture what they needed to from discussions, for example. Writing can help compare and contrast multiple texts. So it's another way, along with graphic organizers, that can do that. It gives another way besides verbal to communicate understanding. So for example, in my classes, I use a lot of discussion, and some students are very good at expressing themselves verbally, but writing may be a little bit more of a struggle, or vice versa. So having this gives them basically more of a repertoire of how they can communicate their understanding to others. Writing also often brings up new questions. So as they try to word things in a particular way that makes sense, they may realize that something doesn't make sense. And so that's an important part of the process, is then they can start to ask questions and get into the detail of the content. Writing can also be really good for reflection and synthesis. So this is an example of a trade book that I used in my other project. And so some ideas for prompts I could use with this would be to write a short summary or an informal abstract of a piece of text that they used from this, because that can have them kind of take what they read and put it in their own words. Also, or to explain their understanding or how their understanding changed after reading this text. So they might have had one idea as they went in, but this text, broadened or addressed the misconceptions. And so that's important for them to explicitly address to move forward. And then also, often it's really important to have them write about some questions. So not only what kind of clarity do they need to understand what they were reading, but also what questions does that bring up? So how can you take what you read and push it a little further? What kind of analysis would you do? What would you ask the author if you had them in the room? So those sorts of things are very helpful. When we start to put this together with other texts, then we can ask questions like, how did the addition of these new texts add to or change their understanding of the content? So for example, I started with the human age, but there's also a book called Humans of Climate Change. So did that add to what they understood about humans' impact on the environment? Did it change it? Did it conflict in different ways? I often also have students explain the graphic organizers that they started to use in writing. So that helps them kind of use a visual and a written explanation, helps them practice communicating in both ways. They might compare and contrast a couple of different texts to look at the importance, the commonality, and the differences. And then one of the biggest parts of synthesis is basically to reflect on their overall understanding at the end. So writing up conclusions about a topic after reading these multiple texts and then referencing from each one of them. So kind of a holistic view together, referencing, what's the evidence, what information did you get from each one of these pieces. So just to give you an example of how I might use all of these strategies together for multiple texts, this is an example from a biology class that I teach. The picture on the right are viruses of different types. And we do a little mini unit on viruses to talk about how viruses have originated, how they contribute to other cells, and how they connect to our definitions and explanation of how life started as we go through things like evolution. So the texts on the left are the ones that we used for this one. They're mainly news articles. So the first thing that I might do is have them take notes with the different strategies that were covered from the 3 different texts that we have, note any new vocabulary, summarize answers to specific questions. So I often will give guiding questions, especially if it's an article that's fairly dense, to help focus the students. So for example, in this case, I might ask, are the viruses alive? So what did this paper say about it? What was the evidence from this paper? And then also, this is a good time to discuss questions that they still have or areas of text that were confusing, which if they're doing their coding and annotating, we should be able to reference back to fairly easily to see what we need to cover together as a class. A next step would be something like analysis. So we have these 3 different texts. So something they could do is use a concept map to show things like what's the overlap and differentiation between characteristics of things that are living and things that are non-living. In this case, we actually had them do a slightly different sort of organizer. We had them create a spectrum from living to non-living, and then place all of the things that we discussed on the line. So in this case, we talked about protocells. We read an article about artificial jellyfish, LUCA, which is the last universal common ancestor. And so they had to basically decide in relation to their criteria, where would they go on the line in reference to each other? So the decision of where to visually put this was important. And then the last step was basically to take this visual that they had and explain it and support it with evidence. So an example is over here on the left. So the student is looking at LUCA, for example, at the beginning, and it talks about what we know about LUCA and why we would reflect on it being in that particular area. And so they can use what they know and the evidence that they've gathered from these readings to support their answer. So this is kind of an interesting project because these papers give several different answers to what does it mean to be alive and are viruses alive. So they have to basically decide what definition they want to start with and then support their answers based on that one set of criteria. So it's a good practice for supporting and giving evidence for opinions or perspectives as well. So multiple texts, basically the big idea is that they are better for literacy. So when you put them together, they give a deepened understanding for students and they can give a lot more context and have students basically find connection to content a lot more than if you only use one sort of traditional text source. So my discussion questions here One of them is, what kinds of strategies do you think would best incorporate trade books with textbooks or other traditional resources? So often the textbook for certain classes is an important book that is used frequently, but how would you incorporate that specifically with other texts? And then also, how would you insist younger grade school students in using multiple texts, specifically in terms of incorporating new vocabulary? This question is sort of because I teach high school students, and I find that incorporating new vocabulary is still very important. But I wonder how it might work in younger grades when students have even less, background in vocabulary in something like science. So those are my questions. If you have some ideas for them, if you can put them down in Google Classroom, that would be really helpful and interesting for me. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and have a wonderful day.